The atmosphere on The View was already thick with anticipation before Karoline Leavitt even stepped onto the set. The audience, a mix of dedicated fans and political spectators, could sense that this wasn't going to be a run-of-the-mill interview. Whoopi Goldberg, seated in her usual position at the center of the panel, had an expression that was both expectant and wary. She knew what was coming. Everyone did. Karoline had been invited to discuss the current state of the Republican Party, particularly in relation to Donald Trump. But the producers weren't looking for a calm discussion. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted conflict, and they had booked the perfect guest for it. As Karoline took her seat, the temperature in the room seemed to shift. She wasn't intimidated. If anything, she looked like she had been waiting for this moment. Across from her, Whoopi's posture stiffened, her eyes narrowing slightly. This wasn't going to be a polite exchange of ideas. It was a battleground, and the first shot was about to be fired. The discussion started tense, but controlled. Karoline, poised and direct, defended the Republican Party's stance, rejecting the common media portrayal of conservatives as racist and homophobic. She spoke with conviction, but her words were met with immediate resistance. Whoopi, who had been in the game long enough to know how to steer a debate, wasted no time in pushing back, her voice laced with skepticism. Then, the first real blow landed. Whoopi's expression hardened as she leaned forward, suggesting that the modern Republican Party had become a safe haven for bigots. The implication was clear. If Karoline defended it, she was defending hatred. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some nodded in agreement. Others shifted in their seats, sensing the tension beginning to rise. Karoline, unfazed, countered sharply, refusing to let the moment go unanswered. Her words came fast, her tone unwavering. She wasn't going to sit there and let Whoopi paint millions of Americans as hateful extremists, but Whoopi wasn't about to back down either. Her voice, now louder, cut through the studio, the frustration creeping in. She dismissed Karoline's argument outright, claiming that actions spoke louder than words, and the actions of the GOP spoke for themselves. The energy in the room had shifted completely. What had started as a debate was rapidly morphing into something else. Neither woman was willing to retreat. The discussion had become a collision course, and neither side was willing to blink first. And then Karoline hit back with a response that sent the tension skyrocketing. She turned the narrative around, pointing out the hypocrisy of Hollywood and the left-wing elite, accusing them of using identity politics as a weapon while ignoring real issues affecting the country. The audience reacted audibly, some in agreement, others in disbelief. Whoopi's jaw tightened. She wasn't just debating a political opponent anymore. She was in a full-blown clash with someone who refused to yield to the usual rhetoric. And she didn't like it. The producers, watching from behind the cameras, knew they had struck gold. The segment was only getting started, but the battle lines had been drawn, and neither woman had any intention of backing down. The tension had reached a breaking point. What had started as a debate was now a full-fledged confrontation unfolding in real time, each exchange more volatile than the last. The View's audience, typically vocal, had fallen into a stunned silence, broken only by the occasional gasp or nervous laughter. This wasn't the usual back-and-forth banter between political guests and the show's hosts. This was something else. Karoline remained unshaken, her demeanor unwavering even as Whoopi's frustration boiled over. The older woman, a veteran of countless debates and controversies, was used to controlling the conversation, shutting down opposing views with sheer force of personality. But this time, she wasn't dealing with a guest who would fold under pressure. Karoline had come prepared, and every attack thrown her way was met with a counterstrike. Whoopi leaned in, her voice rising as she launched into a tirade about the dangers of Trumpism, tying it to historical injustices and the struggles of marginalized communities. The passion in her voice was unmistakable. She wasn't just speaking from a political standpoint, she was speaking from a place of personal conviction. To her, this wasn't just a debate. It was a moral battle, and she was determined to expose Karoline as an apologist for hate. But Karoline was having none of it. Her response was sharp, cutting through Whoopi's rhetoric with precision. She refused to let the view dictate the narrative, calling out what she saw as a blatant misrepresentation of conservative values. She argued that Whoopi and her co-hosts had spent years demonizing half the country, branding anyone who disagreed with them as hateful bigots without even attempting to understand their perspective. The pushback was fierce. Other co-hosts, sensing the moment slipping away from them, jumped in to reinforce Whoopi's position. They rattled off accusations, painting Karoline as complicit in a movement that sought to roll back progress. Their words came rapid-fire, one after another attempting to overwhelm her with sheer numbers. But Karoline wasn't outnumbered. She was outmaneuvering them. Every claim they made, she dismantled. Every attempt to paint her as part of a problematic movement, she flipped on its head. She wasn't just defending herself. She was exposing the hypocrisy in the room, pointing out how the View had made a career out of shaming and silencing voices they didn't agree with. The frustration on Whoopi's face was becoming more evident with each passing moment. The control she usually wielded over discussions was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. Her words became harsher, her tone more aggressive. Then it happened. The moment that would dominate headlines, flood social media, and send shockwaves across the political and entertainment spheres. Whoopi, her patience gone, her anger fully unleashed, spat out a final insult, one that was meant to cut deep, meant to shatter Karoline's composure once and for all. The audience collectively gasped. The other hosts stiffened. Even the production crew behind the cameras froze. But Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't recoil, didn't falter. Instead, she stared straight ahead, letting the moment hang in the air for just long enough for its full weight to settle. And then, with a measured, deliberate response, she turned the entire exchange on its head. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about exposing the very nature of the View. The arrogance, the intolerance disguised as moral superiority. The belief that they could hurl insults at their guests without consequence. Whoopi had snapped. And in doing so, she had given Karoline exactly what she needed. The segment was no longer a debate. It was a disaster for the View, and Karoline was the one in control now. The moment hung in the air, thick with disbelief. Whoopi's insult had detonated like a bomb in the studio, shattering any pretense of civility. The audience, usually quick to rally behind the View's hosts, didn't know how to react. There was a brief, stunned silence before nervous whispers rippled through the crowd. Some gasped, others exchanged uneasy glances, as if realizing that the line had been crossed in a way that couldn't be ignored. The other hosts, too, seemed caught off guard. They had seen Whoopi get heated before, had watched her bulldoze through guests with relentless force. But this was different. This was reckless. Karoline, however, didn't flinch. If anything, the insult had only strengthened her resolve. She had come into this knowing exactly what kind of battlefield she was stepping onto. And now, Whoopi had done the one thing that would change everything. She had lost control. With calculated precision, Karoline leaned in, her expression unreadable, and spoke with a tone that cut through the tension like a knife. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to lash out. She simply let the weight of the moment do the work for her. She reminded Whoopi, reminded the audience, of exactly what had just happened. Of the hypocrisy of a show that claimed to champion women, yet had no problem tearing down one when she dared to challenge them. Of the irony of calling for respect and tolerance, only to launch into personal attacks when the conversation became inconvenient. The audience's murmurs grew louder. Some clapped. Others sat in stunned silence. This wasn't supposed to happen. The View was supposed to be a place where conservative voices came to be berated, mocked, and dismissed. But now, the script had flipped. Whoopi, still fuming, tried to recover. She leaned forward again, voice rising, attempting to regain control. But the moment had already slipped through her fingers. Every attempt to reframe the narrative only made things worse. Karoline was no longer on the defensive. She was dictating the conversation now, exposing the show for what it had become: a platform for ideological bullying, masquerading as progressive discourse. The producers behind the scenes were in full-blown panic mode. This wasn't just a heated debate anymore, this was an on-air disaster. Their earpieces crackled with frantic voices, urging the hosts to pivot, to salvage what was left of the segment. But there was no salvaging this. Karoline had won the moment. But she wasn't finished yet. She shifted her focus, not just to Whoopi, but to the entire panel. One by one, she called them out, reminding them of their own past remarks, their own contradictions, their own hypocrisy. The audience, once so loyal to The View's hosts, was beginning to waver. Whoopi, visibly rattled, now clenched her jaw. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had expected to put Karoline in her place, to make an example of her like so many conservative guests before. Instead, she had given her a platform to dismantle the very credibility of the show, live, in front of millions. The network executives watching from their offices weren't happy. They had tolerated The View's theatrics for years because it brought in ratings. But this was something else. The backlash would be immediate. Sponsors would have questions. Headlines would not be kind. And Karoline knew it. With a final, piercing statement, she delivered the finishing blow. A single, undeniable truth that left Whoopi seething, the other hosts staring at the table, and the audience teetering between shock and admiration. The cameras were still rolling. The moment was cemented. The View had thought they were setting up a battle. Instead, they had set the stage for their own humiliation, and Karoline Leavitt had made sure the world was watching. The segment had unraveled into something far beyond what The View had anticipated. By the time the show cut to commercial, the damage had already been done. The audience wasn't laughing. The co-hosts weren't smugly nodding in self-congratulatory agreement, and Whoopi, normally the show's unshakable force, looked rattled in a way no one had ever seen before. Karoline didn't need to revel in the moment. She had come to prove a point, and she had done exactly that. Whoopi had lashed out in frustration, and in doing so, had shattered the illusion that The View was a place for real discourse. It had been exposed for what it truly was: a machine, designed to destroy opposing viewpoints, one that had just suffered its most public malfunction yet, but the real fallout was only beginning. As soon as the show ended, social media erupted. The clip of Whoopi's insult spread like wildfire, racking up millions of views within hours. It wasn't just conservative circles talking about it. Mainstream media couldn't ignore the backlash either. Outlets that usually turned a blind eye to The View's theatrics were now forced to acknowledge what had happened. Critics called it an unprofessional meltdown. Others pointed out the double standard. If a conservative guest had lashed out at a liberal host in the same way, they would have been crucified. Even some of The View's usual defenders found it difficult to justify Whoopi's behavior. Sponsors took notice. The View was already skating on thin ice with certain advertisers, and now they were being inundated with calls from companies concerned about being associated with a show that had just embarrassed itself on live television. The ABC executives were livid. The View had always been controversial, but it was supposed to be controlled controversy, carefully crafted moments that would go viral just enough to generate buzz without alienating the audience. But this was an uncontained disaster, and Karoline? She wasn't done yet. The next morning, she appeared on multiple news outlets, calmly dissecting everything that had happened. She didn't gloat. She didn't play the victim. She simply laid out the facts, pointing out how The View had spent years branding itself as a forum for strong women, while using bullying tactics to silence those who dared to challenge them. The contrast was stark. On one side, there was Whoopi, whose reputation had taken a devastating hit. On the other, there was Karoline, who had walked into the lion's den, refused to back down, and emerged stronger than ever. The fallout within The View's production team was immediate. Internal meetings were chaotic. Executives demanded an explanation. Whoopi was furious, refusing to apologize, claiming she had been provoked. But the network wasn't looking for excuses. They were looking for damage control. Rumors swirled that producers were considering suspensions, possibly even firings. The View's credibility had taken a severe blow, and ABC needed a scapegoat to stop the bleeding. Karoline had not only won the debate, she had shattered the very foundation of The View's unchecked dominance over daytime political discourse. And, for the first time in years, The View's hosts weren't the ones doing the condemning. They were the ones on trial. The message was clear. The era of unchecked bullying from The View was over, and Karoline Leavitt had made sure the world would never forget it.